Three broke Irishmen, one lost horse that was never really lost, and a lie told on a June night in 1893 that would uncover the richest square mile on Earth. This is the story of a strip of desert so full of gold that miners paved their streets with it and never realized they were walking on a fortune. It is the 14th of June 1893. Somewhere in the parched interior of Western Australia, a small party of prospectors makes camp for the night. One of them, an Irishman named Paddy Hannan, tells the others he is going to stay behind to look for a horse that has wandered off. It is a small, forgettable lie, but Paddy Hannan was not looking for any horse. Earlier that day, he and his two companions, Tom Flanagan and Dan Shea, had crouched in a shallow gully and seen something that stopped their breath. Gold. Not buried deep in hard rock, not hidden in some distant seam, but lying loose in the dirt, glinting in the fading light. Surface gold that a poor man could pick up with the point of a knife. And so Hannan lied, quietly, to buy his party a few precious days to peg their claim before the rest of the world came running. They pegged the ground, and within 3 days, that patch of nothing in the middle of a waterless desert became the beginning of something almost impossible to comprehend. Over the next 130 years, a single square mile of that outback would give up more than 65 million ounces of gold. 65 million. At today's gold price, that is worth on the order of 267 billion United States dollars. From 1 square mile. Not a country, not a continent, not a whole mountain range. 1 mile of dust and scrub, called ever since the Golden Mile. And this is the story of how nature spent 2.5 billion years hiding a treasure here, and how 3 penniless men found it in an afternoon. To understand what Hannan stumbled onto, you have to go back here and about 40 kilometers to the southwest, to a place called Kalgoorlie. In 1892, 2 prospectors named Arthur Bailey and William Ford struck gold there, and the news detonated across the colony. Western Australia had been the poor cousin of the Australian goldfields, overshadowed by the great rushes of the eastern colonies. Kalgoorlie changed everything. Men poured into the interior, into a landscape that did its level best to kill them. There was almost no water, the heat was murderous, the distances were brutal. Prospectors died of thirst and disease chasing rumours, but the lure of gold is older than reason, and they kept coming. Hannan, Flanagan and Shea were part of that human tide. They were experienced men, hard men, who had chased gold across 2 continents, and on that day in June, they were simply passing through, heading elsewhere, when circumstance forced them to stop near a hill that would later be called Mount Charlotte. Accounts differ on exactly why they halted, whether it was a horse that genuinely strayed, or a storm, or simple luck, but halt they did, and that changed everything. Because as they waited, they noticed the ground itself. In a shallow gully, weathered out of the ancient rock and scattered across the surface, were nuggets and specks of gold. And there, in the gully, was the gold. After they pegged their ground, Hannan could not keep the secret forever. On the 17th of June, just 3 days later, he rode into Kalgoorlie carrying around 100 ounces of gold, more than 3 kilograms of it, and registered the find. You cannot walk into a mining town with 3 kilos of gold and expect anyone to keep working their old claim. The word went out like fire. By the end of that month, roughly 1,000 men were digging at what everyone simply called Hannan's. A town would rise here, out of the red dirt, and its name comes from the local Aboriginal word Kulgulu, meaning the silky pear, anglicised into Kalgoorlie. But here is a thing worth pausing on, because it tells you how these fortunes are really made. The 3 men who found the gold did not end up owning the richest ground. The heart of the deposit, the truly staggering wealth, lay a little to the south of Hannan's original find, and it was pegged by other prospectors, men like Sam Pearce and the Brookman brothers. That concentrated strip, barely a mile of ground, became known as the Golden Mile, the richest square mile in the world. Hannan gave his name to the town and to a street, but the deepest riches went, as they so often do, to others. He was granted a small pension later in life, a modest reward for lighting the fuse on one of the greatest gold discoveries in human history. Now, if the story stopped at surface nuggets, Kalgoorlie would just be another gold rush town. What makes it strange, almost unbelievable, is what happened next. Because for the first 3 years, the men of Kalgoorlie were throwing away a fortune. And not just throwing it away, they were paving their streets with it. Here is what happened. The easy surface gold, the poor man's diggings, ran out fairly quickly. As miners dug deeper, they hit a different kind of ore. It was heavy, dark, metallic rock, and when they tested it, it did not behave like gold. It looked, to the untrained eye, like worthless pyrite, the mineral they call fool's gold. There was an enormous amount of this useless-looking rock, and it was getting in the way. So the miners did the practical thing. They hauled it out, dumped it, and used the crushed stone to build and metal the roads of the growing town. For roughly 3 years, the streets of Kalgoorlie were surfaced with rubble that everyone believed was junk. It was not junk. It was some of the richest gold ore ever found. The reason nobody recognized it goes to the very heart of what makes Kalgoorlie geologically special, and we will come to that. But the short version is this. The gold here was not always the familiar yellow metal. Much of it was locked away inside a rare kind of mineral, chemically bonded to another element, hidden in plain sight. When an assayer finally tested this dark rock properly, around 1896, the result must have been staggering. The stone they had been walking on, driving carts over, using to fill potholes, was loaded with gold. And so, in one of the strangest reversals in mining history, the town dug up its own streets. The roads that had been paved with the discarded ore were torn open and carted off to be crushed for the gold everyone had missed. Men had been walking on a treasure for 3 years and never knew it. To understand why the gold was hidden like that, and why so much of it ended up in this one impossibly rich mile, we have to leave the human story for a while and go somewhere far stranger. We have to go back in time more than 2.5 billion years to a world you would not recognize as Earth. The stage for this entire drama is something geologists call the Yilgarn Craton. Now, a craton is one of the oldest, most stable things on the planet. It is an ancient slab of continental crust, a great raft of rock so old and so tough that it has survived, almost unchanged, for billions of years, while the rest of the planet churned and shifted around it. Most of the Earth's surface is young and restless. Cratons are deep, cold bones of the continents. And the Yilgarn Craton of Western Australia is one of the oldest and largest pieces of ancient crust anywhere on Earth. Its rocks range from about 3.1 billion years old down to around 2.65 billion years old. Its granite core is older still. Try to hold that number in your mind because it is almost impossible to feel. 2.5 billion years. The gold at Kalgoorlie was formed before there was complex life on this planet. Before there were plants, before there were animals, before there was a shell or a bone or a leaf. It was formed before the atmosphere itself was breathable, in a time when the air held almost no free oxygen and the oceans were an alien chemistry. When this gold was laid down, the most advanced life on Earth was pond scum. That is the deep time canvas this story is painted on. And the Yilgarn is not just old, it is fabulously, world-changingly rich. This one ancient block of crust is often cited as holding around a third of the world's known gold and a large share of its nickel. It is one of the greatest treasure vaults on the planet, and Kalgoorlie sits right in its heart. So how does an ancient slab of rock end up stuffed with gold? To answer that, we need to look at the rocks themselves. Running through the Yilgarn Craton are long belts of what geologists call greenstone. These are old volcanic and sedimentary rocks, ancient lava flows and seafloor sediments, basalts and tellurides that have been cooked and squeezed deep in the crust. Along the way, minerals like chlorite grew inside them and gave the rock a distinctive greenish tinge, which is where the name comes from. Do not picture a lush green hillside though. These are dark, weathered, iron-stained rocks at the surface, baking under the Australian sun. The green is a clue to their chemistry and their violent volcanic origin, a fingerprint of the ancient ocean floor from which they were born. These greenstone belts are the classic hosts for gold all over the world, and Kalgoorlie sits on one of the most important of them all, a belt of ancient rock that contains most of Australia's lode gold. But within that greenstone belt, one specific slab of rock does almost all the work. About 80% of the Golden Mile's gold comes from a single geological unit called the Golden Mile dolerite. A dolerite is a rock that forms when a thick sheet of magma pushes into the crust and slowly cools underground, solidifying into a hard, dense, dark rock. And that hardness turned out to be the key to everything. Because the Golden Mile dolerite was so hard and so brittle, when the crust was later put under enormous stress, this rock did not bend or flow. It shattered. It cracked into a dense network of fractures, and those cracks, held open in the brittle rock, became the perfect empty spaces for something precious to fill them. Now for the moment the gold actually arrived. Roughly 2,640 million years ago, so 2.64 billion years, this part of the world was caught up in a mountain-building event, what geologists call an orogeny. The crust was being crushed and folded and heated. Deep down, hot fluids, superheated water, were squeezed out of the rocks and forced upward through the crust. These fluids carried gold in solution, dissolved and invisible, drawn up from deep in the earth. Think of the whole thing as a plumbing system, a network of pipes and cracks through which mineral-rich water was pumped through the crust over a very long span of time. Where those hot, gold-bearing fluids hit the shattered Golden Mile dolerite, the conditions changed. Pressure dropped, chemistry shifted, and the gold came out of solution and deposited into the cracks, again and again, over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. The dolerite acted like a sponge full of open spaces, and the fluids filled it with a dense swarm of gold-bearing veins. That is the essence of it. A brittle rock that could hold open cracks and a supply of gold-carrying fluid to fill them. But there is one more ingredient, and it may be the most important of all. The fluids did not just wander randomly through the crust. They were channeled, guided, focused by a single colossal structure. Running through this region is a giant fracture in the Earth's crust called the Boulder-Lefroy Fault, together with a related branch known as the Golden Mile Fault. This is a regional fault, a fracture along which two blocks of crust slid past one another, and it runs for a very long way. And this one fault system is the single most intensely mineralized structure in the entire Yilgarn Craton. Along its length, geologists estimate more than 2,150 tons of gold have been concentrated. Tons. That one crack in the earth is, quite literally, the master valve of the whole system. So now you have the complete recipe for the richest square mile on Earth, and it is beautifully simple. Take a giant plumbing fault to channel the fluids. Add a hard, brittle host rock, the Golden Mile dolerite, to shatter and hold open the cracks. Then pump gold-carrying fluid through the whole thing for millions of years during a mountain-building event, more than 2.5 billion years ago. The fault delivered the gold. The dolerite trapped it. And the result is a concentration of wealth unlike almost anywhere else on the planet. Now we come back to that mystery of the streets, because the geology explains it. Most of the Golden Mile's gold sits in steeply tilted structures called the Fimiston lodes. These are quartz and carbonate wrapped in altered rock that plunge down into the earth. And here is the twist that fooled an entire town. In many gold deposits, the gold is native, meaning it is more or less pure metallic gold that you can see and recognise. But at Kalgoorlie, a great deal of the gold is not free metal at all. It is chemically bonded to another element, tellurium, forming minerals called tellurides. And these telluride minerals do not look like gold. They look grey or dark or metallic in a way that reads as worthless. The most important of them here is a mineral called calaverite, gold telluride, the most abundant precious metal telluride in the deposit. Alongside it are others with names like coloradoite, which is mercury telluride, and petsite and crenorite. In fact, the Golden Mile is one of the greatest telluride deposits in the entire world, and geologists have identified 19 different tellurium-bearing minerals here. That is why they paved the streets with it. The dark, heavy telluride ore did not announce itself as gold, because chemically, it was not gold in the simple sense. The gold was hidden inside calaverite, locked into the crystal structure, invisible to a hopeful eye and a simple test. It took proper assaying to reveal the truth. And when it did, those humble grey roads turned out to be paved with one of the richest ores ever mined. And the shape of that ore is worth picturing. The individual lodes, the ribbons of rich rock, could run up to around 1,800 metres long and 1,200 metres deep, but often only about 10 metres wide. Think about that. Thin sheets of extreme wealth, wider than a football field is long in one dimension, plunging deeper than the tallest buildings on Earth are high, yet often no thicker than a small room, stacked and repeated through the rock like pages in a book. Miners chase these ribbons down into the darkness, and by doing so they turn the ground beneath the town into something extraordinary. Because as the surface gold gave out, the mining went underground, and it went deep. Shafts were sunk, tunnels were driven along the lodes, following the gold down into the earth. By 1903, just 10 years after Hannan's lie, the Golden Mile had something like 49 operating mines, around 100 headframes standing over the shafts, and more than 3,000 kilometres of underground workings. 3,000 kilometres of tunnels, drives and stopes, honeycombing the rock beneath Kalgoorlie and its sister town of Boulder. There was quite literally an underground vast dark labyrinth carved into 2.5 billion year old rock, all of it chasing those thin ribbons of calaverite down into the deep. But none of it could have happened without solving one impossible problem: water. Kalgoorlie sat in a desert with almost none of it, and you cannot run a town, let alone a mining industry, without water. The solution was one of the boldest engineering feats of the age. An engineer named Charles Yelverton O'Connor designed a scheme to pump fresh water more than 530 kilometres inland, all the way from a weir near Perth up over hundreds of kilometres of rising ground to the goldfields. It was so audacious that many people mocked it as a fantasy, an impossible waste of money. The Goldfields water supply scheme was completed in 1903 and it worked, delivering the water that made modern Kalgoorlie possible. But there is a shadow over this triumph. O'Connor, worn down by criticism and controversy, took his own life in 1902, the year before his great pipeline began to flow. He never saw it succeed. A tragedy folded inside one of the country's proudest achievements. For decades, the mining continued underground, mine by mine, lease by lease, working its own patch of the Golden Mile. And then, in 1989, everything changed again. A company called Kalgoorlie Consolidated Gold Mines, KCGM, was formed, and it did something radical. Instead of dozens of separate underground mines, all chasing the lodes in their own cramped leases, KCGM consolidated the tangle of claims into a single, enormous open cut. The idea was to stop tunnelling after individual veins, and instead simply remove the entire hillside, the whole gold-bearing structure, in one gigantic pit. The smaller pits were amalgamated, the old underground workings were largely phased out, and in their place, a machine began to carve a canyon out of the earth. They called it the Fimiston Open Pit. Everyone else called it the Super Pit. And the scale of what they built is genuinely difficult to grasp. The Super Pit is around 3.5 kilometres long, roughly 1.5 to 1.6 kilometres wide, and more than 675 metres. It is a man-made canyon so vast that you can see it clearly from space. Trucks the size of houses crawl along the terraced walls, hauling ore up out of the depths, and from the rim of the pit, those enormous machines look like toys. For decades, it was the largest open-cut gold mine in all of Australia, holding that title until late 2015. And the full gold deposit it is chasing, the whole envelope of mineralised rock, is even bigger than the pit, over 5 kilometres long, up to about 2 kilometres wide, and around 1 kilometre deep. Let us go back to the money, because the numbers here are the whole point, and they are staggering. More than 65 million ounces of gold have come out of the Golden Mile over roughly 130 years. Of that, the Super Pit alone has produced tens of millions of ounces since 1999. Now put a price on it. At a gold price of a little over $4,100 per ounce, 65 million ounces is worth on the order of 267 billion United States dollars. Even if you are conservative and use a lower price, you are still looking at more than $260 billion from 1 square mile of desert. You may have heard even wilder figures thrown around, numbers like $13 trillion attached to Kalgoorlie. It is worth being honest here. Those enormous figures are headline exaggerations. They come from counting gold still in the ground, resources not yet mined, and multiplying by high prices to produce a shock number. The defensible, verifiable figure, the value of the gold actually produced, is on the order of $260 to $270 billion. And frankly, that is astonishing enough. You do not need to inflate it. $260 billion from a single mile of dirt is one of the most concentrated fortunes ever pulled from the surface of the earth. And that word, concentrated, is the key to the whole title. Because when people call the Golden Mile the richest square mile on Earth, they are talking about concentration. Plenty of ground has produced a lot of gold, but almost nowhere has packed so much gold into so small a footprint. The current ore grade at the mine is around 1.3 grams of gold per ton of rock, and historically it ranged higher, up to a little over 2 grams per ton. Let that sink in. To win a single gram of gold, roughly the weight of a paperclip, the mine must dig up, crush, and process nearly a ton of rock. That is the reality of modern gold mining, moving mountains for a metal you could hold in your hand. And yet, because the deposit is so vast and so concentrated, it is worth every ton. The old underground lodes were far richer still, some so rich the gold was visible to the naked eye. But the real superlative is not the grade of any single ton, it is the sheer amount of gold squeezed into that 1 mile of ground. That is what makes it the richest square mile in the world. It is a record of concentration, of nature cramming an unbelievable treasure into the smallest possible space. Now, this is the moment where an honest documentary has to make a distinction, because a sharp-eyed viewer will catch it otherwise. The Golden Mile is the richest square mile on Earth, but it is not the richest goldfield overall. those are two very different claims. The title of the single greatest goldfield in human history belongs not to Australia, but to South Africa, to a place called the Witwatersrand Basin. The Witwatersrand has produced something like 40% of all the gold ever mined in the entire history of humanity. 40% of all the gold ever. In total endowment, it dwarfs Kalgoorlie many times over. So how can both things be true? Simple. The Witwatersrand is the richest field by total amount, spread across a vast basin, an enormous geological province. The Golden Mile is the richest by concentration, the most gold ever packed into a single square mile. Witwatersrand is the biggest treasure chest. The Golden Mile is the most treasure crammed into the smallest box. Both are true, and stating that plainly does not weaken Kalgoorlie's story. It sharpens it. Because being the most concentrated gold deposit of its kind on the planet, one of the world's great telluride camps, controlled by the single most intensely mineralized fault in one of Earth's richest cratons, is more than superlative enough. So what of Kalgoorlie today? And what happens when the gold finally runs out? The ownership of the super pit reads like a game of corporate chess. After KCGM was formed, its two halves were traded between mining giants over the years, passing through the hands of some of the biggest names in global gold, Homestake and Normandy, then Barrick and Newmont, and finally, in 2019 and 2020, into the hands of two Australian companies, Saracen and Northern Star Resources, which then merged. Today, the super pit is owned entirely by Northern Star Resources. The tangle of little claims that three Irishmen and a handful of prospectors once pegged by hand has been swallowed, over 130 years, into a single modern corporation. And it is still going. The processing mill at Fimiston treats more than 13 million tonnes of ore every year, and there are approved plans to expand that to 27 million tonnes a year by the end of the decade. In recent years, the operation has poured around 420,000 ounces of gold in a tough year, historically 600,000 to 750,000, and the expansion aims to push that up toward about 900,000 ounces a year by around 2029. As of early 2026, the mine still holds ore reserves of around 15 million ounces, with total mineral resources of more than 40 million ounces still identified in the ground. At current rates, that means the gold at Kalgoorlie will keep flowing for many years yet, likely well into the coming decades. There is no official date on which the last ounce will be poured, but one day, inevitably, it will come. And that is the quiet question hanging over the whole place.
Kalgoorlie Boulder is a town of around 30,000 people that exists fundamentally because of the gold beneath it. The pit blasts on a schedule, the trucks run day and night, the town lives to the rhythm of the mine, and slowly that vast canyon eats its way through the 2.5 billion year old rock, chasing the last of the ribbons of calaverite down into the deep. Someday, the gold that took the Earth 2.5 billion years to hide and that 3 broke prospectors uncovered with a lie about a lost horse will finally be gone. And what will remain is the pit itself, a hole in the ground so large you can see it from space, a monument to the strangest kind of treasure hunt, and a reminder that sometimes the richest thing on Earth is hiding right beneath your feet, in the streets you are walking on, waiting billions of years for someone to finally see it.